In the shadows of Montana's rugged mountains, a desperate handshake sealed a most unusual bargain. Thomas Mitchell, a cowboy with nothing but calloused hands and fading dreams, stood before Victoria Harrington, the wealthiest widow in 3 counties. "Marriage," she'd said, her voice as firm as the oak beneath her feet. "1 month as my husband, and when I'm gone, everything I own becomes yours." He'd hesitated only a moment before accepting her outstretched hand, never suspecting the truth. She kept locked away would change not just his fortune, but his very soul. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1882 brought nothing but dust and heartache to Silveridge, Montana. The creek beds had dried to cracked scars across the land, and the cattle were thin as the hopes of the men who tended them. Thomas Mitchell wiped sweat from his brow, squinting at the afternoon sun that seemed determined to burn any remaining moisture from the valley. At 32, Tom's life had become a collection of temporary arrangements. He'd been sleeping in a cramped room above Miller's Livery for 8 months now, paying what he could when work allowed. Most nights, he collapsed onto his thin mattress smelling of horse and dirt, too tired even to dream of better days. "Mitchell, get that fence fixed before sundown, or don't bother showing up tomorrow," barked Jedediah Blackwell, owner of the modest spread where Tom had worked the past few weeks. The man was perpetually angry, his fortune dwindling with each passing season of drought. "Yes, sir," Tom replied, hammering another post into the unyielding ground. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through despite the dry air. 3 more. Hours of this, then maybe a whiskey at the Silver Dollar before bed. Such was the rhythm of his days. Work, drink, sleep, repeat. There had been a time when Thomas Mitchell's future looked promising. 10 years earlier, he'd arrived in Montana with his brother William, the 2 of them pooling their savings to purchase a small parcel along the eastern ridge. They'd built a cabin with their own hands, branded their first dozen cattle, and begun the life they'd talked about since they were boys. Then came the winter of 78. The cold had been merciless, snow piling high as a man's chest for weeks without relief. William had ridden out to check on a pregnant heifer and never returned. They found him 3 days later, frozen beside his horse in a ravine. By the time spring arrived, debt and grief had consumed whatever fight remained in Tom. The bank took the land, the cattle were sold at auction, and the cabin eventually became home to a family passing through to Oregon. Now, Tom drifted between ranches, taking whatever work came his way. He was skilled with horses, decent with cattle, and reliable enough that he rarely went more than a week without employment. But he was no closer to owning land again than he was to touching the moon. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Tom drove the final nail into the fence post. His hands were raw, tiny splinters embedded in the flesh he couldn't bother to remove. He gathered his tools, loaded them onto the small wagon, and began the ride back to the main house. The Blackwell Ranch wasn't much compared to some of the larger spreads in the territory, but it was solid enough. A 2-story house painted white, though the paint was peeling in places, and a barn that leaned slightly to the east. As Tom approached, he noticed a sleek black carriage parked near the porch, the horses that pulled it far finer than any animal on Blackwell's property. "Mitchell," Blackwell called from the porch, his usual scowl replaced by something Tom couldn't quite read. "Come up here a minute." Tom secured the wagon and approached cautiously. Standing beside Blackwell was an elderly man in a dark suit, a black medical bag at his feet. "This is Dr. Morris," Blackwell said. "He's come from the Harrington place." The name Harrington carried weight throughout the territory. Victoria Harrington owned the largest cattle operation within 100 miles. Her ranch sprawling across 5,000 acres of prime Montana land. Few people in Silveridge had ever seen the widow in person. Since her husband's death, 15 years earlier, she'd become something of a mystery, managing her empire through a small army of hired hands and appearing in town perhaps once a year. "Mrs. Harrington requires assistance," the doctor said, studying Tom with careful eyes. "She's asked specifically for you, Mr. Mitchell." Tom blinked in confusion. "There must be some mistake. I don't know Mrs. Harrington. There must be some mistake. I don't know Mrs. Harrington. Nevertheless, she's requested your presence at the main house tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp." The doctor handed Tom a sealed envelope. "The directions are inside, along with a small advance for your time." Before Tom could respond, Dr. Morris had turned and climbed back into his carriage. With a snap of the reins, he was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and confusion in his wake. "What in God's name would Victoria Harrington want with you?" Blackwell asked, his voice tinged with suspicion and perhaps a touch of envy. Tom opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded map and 5 $20 bills, more money than he'd seen at once in years. "I have no idea," Tom replied honestly, staring at the fortune in his hands. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Tom lay on his mattress in the room above the livery, listening to the horses shift beneath him. The envelope sat on the small table beside his bed, the money and map still inside. He'd shown it to Jake Wilson, the only man in Silveridge he considered a friend, over whiskeys at the Silver Dollar. "Could be she needs a specific job done," Jake had suggested. "Maybe she heard you're good with breaking horses." "Then why? The money up front?" Tom had asked. "And why me? There are better horsemen in the territory." Jake had shrugged, draining his glass. "Only one way to find out." As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Tom rose and washed in the basin of cold water he kept for the purpose. He shaved carefully with his straight razor, nicking himself only once in his nervousness. From his trunk, he pulled the one good shirt he owned, slightly yellowed with age but clean, and his least worn pair of trousers. The boots would have to do. He had no others. But he polished them as best he could with an old rag. By 7, he was mounted on Rusty, the aging sorrel gelding he'd managed to keep through his worst times. The ride to Harrington Ranch would take nearly 2 hours, and Tom didn't want to risk being late. The morning air was cool against his face as he followed the crude map east out of town, then north along a creek bed that still held a trickle of water despite the drought. The terrain gradually changed from flat grassland to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains stood like sentinels against the brightening sky. As he crested a particularly steep hill, Tom paused to catch his breath. Below him stretched Harrington Ranch, and for a moment he could only stare in awe. Green pastures spread in all directions, fed by an elaborate irrigation system that channeled water from a river to the east. Hundreds of cattle grazed contentedly, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. In the center of this paradise stood a house that was more mansion than ranch home. 3 stories of red brick and white trim, with a wraparound porch and what appeared to be a glass conservatory attached to one side. Tom swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how out of place he would be in such surroundings. But the money in his pocket and the mystery of Mrs. Harrington's summons drove him forward, down the hill toward the grand house below. At precisely 9 o'clock, Tom tied Rusty to a hitching post near what he assumed was the servants' entrance. He didn't presume to approach the grand front doors. Before he could decide on his next move, a tall man with graying temples and the rigid posture of a former soldier appeared. "Mr. Mitchell," the man said, not a question but a statement. "I'm Samuel Becker, foreman of Harrington Ranch. Mrs. Harrington is expecting you in the garden. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, Becker turned and walked along a gravel path that curved around the side of the house. Tom hurried to catch up, acutely aware of the dust on his boots and the sweat dampening his shirt despite the morning coolness. The path led to a walled garden filled with roses of every color imaginable. Stone benches sat beneath flowering arbors, and a small fountain burbled at the center. Seated on one of the benches was a woman Tom judged to be in her early 70s, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her black dress immaculate and clearly expensive. "Mrs. Harrington," Becker announced, "Thomas Mitchell has arrived." Victoria Harrington looked up from the book in her lap, fixing Tom with eyes so dark and penetrating he nearly took a step backward. "Thank you, Samuel," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for her age. "That will be all for now." Becker hesitated, glancing at Tom with undisguised suspicion, before nodding curtly and retreating back down the path. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria said, gesturing to the bench across from her, "please sit." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tom removed his hat and perched uncomfortably on the edge of the stone bench. Up close, he could see that despite her age, Victoria Harrington's face retained traces of what must have been remarkable beauty in her youth. Her skin was lined but clear, her posture perfect, her hands adorned with several gold rings that caught the sunlight as she closed her book. "I imagine you're wondering why I've asked you here," she began, studying him with unnerving intensity. "Yes, ma'am," Tom replied, resisting the urge to fidget under her gaze. "I'll be direct, Mr. Mitchell. I am dying. Dr. Morris gives me 3 months at most." The blunt statement caught Tom off guard. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am." A slight smile curved her lips. "Are you? You don't know me." "No, ma'am, but I wouldn't wish such news on anyone." Victoria nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. "Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, what do you know about me?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Only what most folks know. That you own the largest ranch in the territory, that your husband died some years back, that you keep to yourself." "Indeed. And what would you say if I told you I've been watching you for some time?" A chill ran down Tom's spine despite the warming day. "I'd ask why, ma'am?" "Because I need something from you, Mr. Mitchell, something rather unusual." She paused, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "I want you to marry me." Tom was certain he'd misheard. "I beg your pardon." "Marriage, Mr. Mitchell? A legal union between myself and you. To be clear, this would be a marriage in name only. I require a husband for very specific reasons, and you suit my purposes." Tom stared at her, waiting for some indication that this was an elaborate joke. When none came, he cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harrington, why would you want to marry a man you don't know? A man with nothing to his name?" "That is precisely why you are suitable," she replied calmly. "You have no family entanglements, no fortune to complicate matters. You have a reputation as an honest worker despite your circumstances, and you are, I'm told, in need of a change in fortune." Tom's mind raced. "And what would I be expected to do as your husband?" "Very little. Move into the east wing of the house, accompany me to dinner each evening, sign certain papers when required. When I die, which, as I've mentioned, will be soon, you will inherit everything. The ranch, the cattle, the accounts in the bank in Helena. All of it." The enormity of what she was suggesting left Tom speechless. Harrington Ranch was worth more money than he could comprehend. Even a fraction of such wealth would change his life forever. "Why me?" he finally managed to ask. "Surely there are others." "I have my reasons, Mr. Mitchell." Victoria's voice had taken on an edge that suggested she wasn't accustomed to explaining herself. "Do you accept my proposal, or shall I find someone else?" The rational part of Tom's mind screamed that this was too strange, too sudden, that nothing this easy could be without complication. But the part of him that had struggled for so long, that had watched his dreams turn to dust year after year, saw an opportunity he couldn't refuse. "I accept," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he fully realized his decision. Victoria nodded once, as if the matter was settled. "Good. The wedding will take place tomorrow morning at the chapel. In town, Dr. Morris has already secured the license. Samuel will show you to your quarters." She rang a small silver bell that sat on the bench beside her. "One more thing, Mr. Mitchell." "Yes, ma'am?" "There is a locked room on the 3rd floor of this house. Under no circumstances are you to attempt to enter it. Is that understood?" Tom nodded slowly, wondering what new mystery this was. "Understood. Very well. I will see you at dinner." With that dismissal, Victoria Harrington reopened her book, and Tom knew the conversation was over. As he followed Becca back toward the house, Tom's head spun with questions. What had just happened? Why would a woman of Victoria Harrington's standing choose him for such an arrangement? And what secrets lay behind that locked door she was so keen to protect? One thing was certain: his life had just changed forever. For better or worse remained to be seen. The room Samuel Becker showed Tom to was larger than the entire cabin he'd once shared with his brother. Polished hardwood floors stretched beneath an ornate rug in shades of burgundy and gold. A 4-poster bed dominated one wall, across from a stone fireplace tall enough for a man to stand in. The windows overlooked the eastern pastures, where fat cattle grazed contentedly beneath the midday sun. "Dinner is at 7 sharp," Becker said, his tone making it clear he disapproved of the entire arrangement. "Mrs. Harrington expects punctuality." "I understand," Tom replied, still overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding him. Becker hesitated. In the doorway, "Mitchell, I don't know what game you're playing, but these are good people here at Harrington Ranch. If you're thinking to take advantage—" "I'm not playing any game," Tom interrupted. "Mrs. Harrington made me an offer, that's all I know." The foreman studied him a moment longer before nodding curtly. "Your things will be brought from town. If you need anything, ring the bell." He pointed to a braided cord hanging beside the bed before closing the door firmly behind him. Alone, Tom sank onto the edge of the mattress, softer than any he'd ever felt. What had he agreed to? Marriage to a woman old enough to be his mother, possibly his grandmother. A woman he'd known for less than an hour. Yet the alternative, returning to Blackwell Ranch, to the endless cycle of hard work and poverty, was unthinkable now that he'd glimpsed another path. Tom spent the afternoon exploring the parts of the house he felt comfortable entering. The library contained more books than he'd ever seen in one place, many in languages he couldn't identify. The parlor featured a piano and several uncomfortable-looking chairs arranged for conversation that likely never occurred, given Victoria's reclusive nature. The dining room could easily seat 20, though Tom suspected it rarely held more than one. Throughout his exploration, he encountered various servants, a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, all of whom regarded him with the same suspicious curiosity. Clearly, his arrival was as unexpected to them as Victoria's proposal had been to him. At precisely 7 o'clock, Tom presented himself in the dining room, wearing the same clothes he'd arrived in, having nothing finer. Victoria was already seated at the head of the long table. She'd changed into a dark green dress, her silver hair arranged differently, though still severely pulled back. A single candelabra illuminated her face, softening the lines time had etched there. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing to the chair at her right hand. "You're prompt, I appreciate that." Tom sat awkwardly, acutely aware of his rough hands against the fine linen tablecloth. A maid appeared silently, serving a soup he didn't recognize, but found delicious. For several minutes they ate without speaking, the only sound the occasional clink of silver against china. "Tomorrow, after the ceremony," Victoria finally said, "we will visit the bank in Helena. There are papers to sign, accounts to update." Tom nodded. unsure what response was expected. "You'll need suitable clothing," she continued, appraising his appearance with a critical eye. "Samuel will take you to the tailor in the morning." "Mrs. Harrington," Tom said carefully, "I still don't understand why you've chosen me for this arrangement." Victoria set down her spoon and studied him. "Does it matter? You stand to gain everything. Most men wouldn't question such fortune." "I'm not most men." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, you're not. That's part of the reason." She took a sip of wine. "I require a husband for legal purposes, Mr. Mitchell. Montana territorial law has certain stipulations regarding widows and inheritance. A husband simplifies matters considerably." The explanation made practical sense, yet Tom sensed there was more she wasn't saying. "And the locked room? What's in there that's so important?" Victoria's expression hardened. "That is not your concern. Not yet." She rang a small silver bell, and the maid reappeared to clear the soup bowls. "The terms of our agreement are simple. You will live here, act as my husband in public matters, and in return, you will inherit everything when I'm gone. The only requirement is that you respect my privacy regarding certain aspects of my life. Is that acceptable?" Put that way, it seemed foolish to question further. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. And Mr. Mitchell, tomorrow, after we are married, you will call me Victoria." The wedding took place at 9 the following morning in Silveridge's small white chapel. Tom stood beside Victoria before a preacher who seemed distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings, but unwilling to refuse the territory's wealthiest resident. Dr. Morris attended as witness, along with Samuel Becker, whose disapproval was palpable even from the back pew where he stood. Tom wore a new suit, hastily fitted that morning by a tailor who'd opened his shop early at Samuel's insistence. The wool was finer than any he'd ever worn, the shirt collar uncomfortably stiff against his neck. Victoria wore black, as she had each time Tom had seen her, though this dress featured delicate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken without emotion on either side. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Victoria offered her cheek, which Tom dutifully kissed. No music played, no rice was thrown. They exited the chapel to find the same black carriage that had brought Dr. Morris to Blackwell Ranch, waiting to take them directly to the bank in Helena. News travels quickly in small towns. By noon, all of Silveridge knew that Thomas Mitchell, a nobody cowhand with more debts than prospects, had married Victoria Harrington, the wealthiest widow in the territory. Speculation ran wild. Some said Victoria had lost her mind. Others suggested Tom must have blackmailed her somehow. The more charitable thought perhaps Victoria was simply lonely after 15 years of widowhood. Jake Wilson heard the news while shoeing a horse at the blacksmith's shop. "Married," he repeated, nearly dropping his hammer. "Tom Mitchell to Victoria Harrington this very morning," confirmed Eliza Thompson, who cleaned the chapel and had witnessed the ceremony from the vestibule. Quick as you please, no fuss at all. She didn't even smile once. Jake frowned, thinking of his conversation with Tom at the Silver Dollar. Did Tom seem willing? "Willing?" Eliza laughed. He looked like a man who'd stumbled onto a gold mine. Nervous, mind you, but certainly not unwilling. Jake wasn't convinced. He'd known Tom for years, ever since they'd worked together breaking horses for the army. Tom wasn't the type to marry for money, no matter how desperate his circumstances. Something else was happening here, something Jake couldn't quite figure. Meanwhile, in the Helena National Bank, Tom sat beside Victoria in a private office as an elderly banker named Whitmore reviewed a stack of documents. "These papers transfer ownership of all Harrington properties to both your names as joint tenants," Whitmore explained, sliding a document toward them. "Upon Mrs. Harrington's death, full ownership would pass to you, Mr. Mitchell, without the need for probate." Tom's hand trembled slightly as he signed where indicated. The enormity of what was happening, the wealth he was suddenly connected to, made his head swim. Victoria signed with a firm hand, her expression revealing nothing. "And these," Whitmore continued, presenting another set of papers, "grant Mr. Mitchell access to all Harrington accounts, effective immediately." Victoria paused, fixing Tom with a penetrating stare. "You will not access these accounts during my lifetime without my express permission. Is that understood?" "Of course," Tom agreed readily. The idea that he might start spending Victoria's money hadn't even occurred to him. "Very well." She signed the documents and pushed them toward Tom. By the time they left the bank, the afternoon was waning. Victoria looked more tired than Tom had yet seen her, the lines in her face deeper, her movements slower. "Are you well?" he asked as Samuel helped her into the carriage. "I am dying, Mr. Mitchell," she replied matter-of-factly. "Some days are better than others. Today has been taxing." The ride back to the ranch passed in silence. Tom watched the landscape roll by, trying to reconcile the events of the past 24 hours with the reality of his new situation. He was married to a dying woman, a woman with secrets she guarded fiercely, and when she died, he would be one of the wealthiest men in Montana territory. It felt unreal, like a story someone else was telling, yet the gold band on his finger, simple, unadorned, was tangible proof of his new state. Upon their return to the ranch, Victoria retired immediately to her rooms, leaving Tom at loose ends. He wandered the grounds until sunset, familiarizing himself with what would someday be his property. The stables housed over 30 horses, most finer than any Tom had ever worked with. The main barn was immaculate, the equipment all well-maintained. Even the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived was in better condition than most houses Tom had inhabited. Quite a step up from Blackwell's place, isn't it? Tom turned to find Samuel Becker regarding him from the doorway of the tack room. "It's impressive," Tom agreed cautiously. "Mrs. Harrington, Victoria, built most of this herself, you know, after Henry died. Everyone expected her to sell, move back east. Instead, she expanded, doubled the herd, bought out 3 neighboring spreads." Samuel ran a hand along a saddle rack. "She's a remarkable woman." Tom sensed a shift in the foreman's attitude. "You care about her." 15 years I've worked for her, seen her through the worst times. She doesn't let many people close, but those she does. Don Samuel shrugged. "We're loyal." "I didn't ask for this arrangement," Tom said, feeling a need to defend himself. "She approached me. I know. That's what confuses me. Why you?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What does she see in you that the rest of us don't?" It was a question Tom had been asking himself since yesterday morning in the rose garden. "I wish I knew." Samuel studied him a moment longer. "Dinner's at 7. Don't be late." He turned to go, then paused. "And Mitchell, whatever game this is, remember that there are people here who care what happens to her." Tom nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair. Victoria ate little, though she made an effort to maintain conversation, asking Tom about his experience with horses and cattle. He answered honestly, neither inflating nor diminishing his abilities. If he was to run this ranch someday, there would be no benefit in pretending to know more than he did. After the meal, Victoria invited Tom to join her in the library. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. Victoria settled into a wingback chair, gesturing for Tom to take its twin across from her. "You have questions," she stated, pouring herself a small measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Many," Tom admitted. "Ask them then. I may not answer all, but I will not lie to you." Tom considered carefully, aware that this might be his only opportunity for candor. "Why did you really choose me? There must be dozens of men more qualified to run this ranch." Victoria sipped her drink thoughtfully. "Qualification was not my primary concern. I needed someone honest, someone without entanglements or pretensions, someone with nothing to lose." "But why marry at all? Surely you could leave the ranch to whoever you wanted in your will." "It's not that simple." Victoria set down her glass. "Henry's family has been trying to contest my ownership since his death. They believe a woman cannot successfully run an operation of this size. Their attempts have failed thus far, but they are persistent. If I die without a clear heir, preferably male, they will swoop in like vultures." Tom frowned. "And you have no children, no family of your own?" A shadow passed across Victoria's face. "No living children, no family I acknowledge." She lifted her glass again, her hand less steady now. "Henry's nephew, Philip, was especially eager to see me fail. He has powerful friends, connections. I lack. Marriage provides protection that a simple will would not." The explanation made sense, yet Tom still felt there were pieces missing from the puzzle. "And the locked room? What's in there that's so important to keep secret?" Victoria's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "That is not a question I will answer tonight, perhaps not ever." She rose with effort, suddenly looking every one of her years. "It's been a long day, Mr. Mitchell. Thomas, I bid you good night." Before Tom could respond, she had left the room, the sound of her cane tapping against the hardwood growing fainter as she retreated down the hallway. For the next week, Tom settled into a strange routine. He rose early, as he had his entire life, and spent the mornings learning about the ranch operations from Samuel, who had gradually become less hostile once convinced that Tom genuinely wanted to understand the business. The afternoons Tom often spent with Dr. Morris, who visited daily to check on Victoria's condition and seemed willing to answer some of Tom's questions about his new wife. "She was quite beautiful in her youth," Morris told him as they walked. "The grounds one particularly fine afternoon. Henry brought her back from San Francisco, caused quite a stir. She was an actress, you see." An actress? Tom couldn't hide his surprise. Victoria's severe demeanor didn't suggest a theatrical background. Oh yes, quite talented apparently. Henry saw her in a production of Shakespeare, Macbeth I believe, and was smitten immediately. The doctor smiled at the memory. They were devoted to each other. His death nearly destroyed her. How did he die? Pneumonia. Simple as that. Strong as an ox his whole life, then gone in a week. Morris shook his head. Victoria never fully recovered, I think. Threw herself into the ranch instead. Tom considered this new information. And her illness now? What exactly is wrong with her? The doctor's expression grew somber. Cancer. Inoperable. It spread throughout her abdomen. I can manage her. Pain, but that's all. He glanced at Tom curiously. She hasn't told you the details. She's told me very little, Tom admitted. Our marriage is unconventional. Morris chuckled. That's one way to describe it. Though I must say, she seems lighter somehow since you arrived. I haven't seen her eat so well in months. The doctor's observation surprised Tom. He'd noticed no such change in Victoria, who remained formal and somewhat distant during their daily interactions. Each evening they dined together, making polite conversation about the ranch, the weather, occasionally politics. After dinner, Victoria would retire to her rooms, leaving Tom to his own devices. More than once, Tom found himself on the third floor, standing before the locked door Victoria had forbidden him to enter. The heavy oak door gave no hint of what might lie beyond. There was no keyhole to peek through, no gap beneath to glimpse anything of the room's contents, just solid, unyielding wood and a brass handle that refused to turn beneath his cautious testing. On the 8th day of their marriage, Tom rode into Silveridge to meet Jake Wilson at the Silver Dollar. He felt he owed his friend an explanation, though he wasn't entirely sure what he could say that wouldn't violate Victoria's privacy. The saloon fell silent when Tom entered, all eyes turning to regard the cowboy who'd suddenly married into fortune. He nodded uncomfortably to a few familiar faces before spotting Jake at a corner table. "Well, if it isn't the luckiest bastard in Montana," Jake said by way of greeting, pushing a whiskey across the table. "Or should I call you Mr. Harrington now?" Tom winced. "Don't start. Can you blame me? Last I saw you, you were worried about making rent on that room above Miller's. Now you're married to the richest widow in 3 territories." Jake leaned forward. "What's really going on, Tom?" Tom sipped his whiskey, choosing his words carefully. "It's complicated. Victoria needed a husband for legal reasons. I happened to be available." "Legal reasons?" Jake's eyebrows rose. "And what do you get out of this arrangement? When she dies, I inherit everything." Even saying it aloud felt surreal to Tom. Jake whistled low. "And when might that be?" "Soon," Tom replied, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "She's ill." "So I've heard." Jake studied his friend's face. "You barely know this woman, Tom. Don't you find it strange that she'd leave everything to a stranger?" The question echoed Tom's own doubts. "Of course I do, but she has her reasons." "Such as?" Tom shook his head. "I can't say more. I gave my word." Jake sat back, clearly unsatisfied, but knowing his friend well enough to recognize when he'd hit a wall. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing. Town's talking. Some say you tricked her somehow. Others think she's lost her mind. Philip Harrington was in here 2 days ago, telling anyone who'd listen that you're a fortune hunter who'll run that ranch into the ground." "Philip Harrington?" Tom straightened. "Henry's nephew?" "One and the same. Nasty piece of work, if you ask me. Seemed mighty interested in how long you'd known Victoria before the wedding." Tom frowned. The mention of Philip confirmed part of Victoria's story, at least. There were indeed relatives circling, waiting for an opportunity to challenge her control of the ranch. "I should get back," Tom said, finishing his drink. "Victoria doesn't know I came to town." Jake nodded. "Be careful, Tom. Whatever's happening here, I doubt it's as simple as it seems." Tom's ride back to the ranch gave him ample time to think. Jake was right. Nothing about this situation was simple. Victoria was hiding something important, something connected to that locked room on the 3rd floor. Whatever it was had prompted her to marry a stranger rather than face death alone. As he approached the main house, Tom noticed unusual activity. 3 unfamiliar horses were tied at the hitching post, and raised voices could be heard from inside. Quickening his pace, Tom entered to find Victoria standing in the foyer, facing a well-dressed man of about 50, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd, Victoria," the man was saying. "You expect us to believe this marriage is legitimate? He's half your age and nobody from nowhere. It's clearly a pathetic attempt to circumvent Henry's family's rightful claim." "My marriage is none of your concern, Philip," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. "The law recognizes it, as do the bank and the territorial authorities. Your opinion is irrelevant. We'll see what the judge has to say about a deathbed marriage to a fortune hunter." Philip spat, then noticed Tom standing in the doorway. "Ah, speak of the devil. Come to check on your investment, Mr. Mitchell?" Tom moved to Victoria's side, instinctively placing himself between her and her antagonist. "This is my home. Mr. Harrington, I believe you're the one who's checking on investments that aren't yours." Philip's eyes narrowed. "Don't get comfortable, cowboy. When Victoria dies, which we all know will be soon, I'll see you run off this property with nothing but the clothes on your back." "That's enough!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "Get out, Philip, now, or I'll have Samuel throw you out." As if summoned by his name, the foreman appeared in the doorway to the study, his hand resting meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. Philip glanced from Samuel to Victoria to Tom, then smiled coldly. "This isn't over," he said, gesturing to the two men who had accompanied him, lawyers by the looks of their attire. "Not by a long shot." After they had gone, Victoria sagged, visibly. Tom reached out to steady her, surprised when she didn't pull away from his touch. "Are you all right?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "I need to sit down," she murmured. Tom helped her to the parlor, where she sank into a chair, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Should I send for Dr. Morris?" Victoria shook her head. "No, this will pass. It always does." She closed her eyes briefly. "Philip has been trying to take the ranch since Henry died. He believes it's his birthright, regardless of what Henry's will stated. He seems determined," Tom observed, pouring Victoria a glass of water from a nearby carafe. "Determined is one word for it. Obsessed would be another." Victoria accepted the water gratefully. "Thank you for coming to my defense. You didn't have to do that." Tom shrugged. "Seemed like the thing a husband would do." The ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. "Indeed." She studied Tom thoughtfully. "You went into town today." It wasn't a question, but Tom nodded anyway. "To see a friend. Jake Wilson. We worked together a few years back." "I see." Victoria set down her glass. "Did you tell him about our arrangement?" "Only what he'd already guessed, that it's a marriage of convenience, that you needed a husband for legal reasons." Tom hesitated. "I didn't betray your confidence." "I believe you." Victoria's gaze was evaluating. "You're a man of your word, Thomas Mitchell. That's rarer than you might think." The genuine note of approval in her voice warmed Tom more than he expected. "This Philip, is he dangerous?" "He's vindictive and entitled, a dangerous combination." Victoria straightened in her chair, some of her strength returning. "But he's also a coward at heart. He makes threats but rarely follows through." Tom wasn't so certain. The hatred in Philip Harrington's eyes had seemed very real. What happens if he contests the marriage in court? He won't get far. Our marriage is legal and binding. The property transfers are complete. And besides, Victoria added with a curious smile, "I've taken other precautions." Before Tom could ask what she meant, Samuel appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, Dr. Morris is here for your afternoon visit." Victoria nodded. "Send him in." She turned back to Tom. "Thank you again for your intervention. It seems I chose better than I knew." As Tom left Victoria with the doctor, he found himself increasingly troubled by the day's events. Not just Philip's threats, though those were concerning enough, but his own reaction to them. He'd felt genuinely protective of Victoria, angry at the way Philip had spoken to her. It was strange how quickly he'd begun to feel a responsibility toward this woman he barely knew. That evening at dinner, Victoria seemed more animated than usual, asking Tom about his visit to town, about Jake, about his life before coming to Harrington Ranch. Tom answered openly, telling her about his brother William, about the ranch they'd tried to build together, about the devastating winter that had changed everything. "You loved him very much," Victoria observed when Tom described finding his brother's body in the ravine. "He was all the family I had," Tom replied simply. "And afterwards, no thought to start your own family?" Tom shook his head. "Never met. The right woman, I suppose. Or when I did, I was in no position to offer her anything." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "Life rarely follows the path we envision for ourselves." She set down her fork, having eaten more than Tom had ever seen. Her consume. "Thomas, I believe it's time I showed you what's behind that locked door." Tom's heart quickened. "You're sure?" "No," Victoria admitted with a small smile. but I'm going to show you anyway. After dinner, meet me on the 3rd floor. The meal concluded with a tension that hadn't been present before. Tom found himself rushing through his dessert, eager yet apprehensive about what Victoria might reveal. When they finally rose from the table, Victoria moved with purpose, despite her evident physical discomfort. "Samuel knows we're not to be disturbed," she said, as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. "What I'm about to share with you, I've shared with no one since Henry died." They reached the locked door, and Victoria removed a key from a chain around her neck. Her hand trembled slightly as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a solid click, and the door swung inward. "After you," Victoria said, stepping aside. Taking a deep breath, Tom crossed the threshold into Victoria Harrington's most guarded secret. The room beyond the locked door was not at all what Tom had expected. Instead of darkness and mystery, he found himself standing in a light-filled studio. Large windows faced north, capturing the golden glow of the setting sun. Canvases leaned against walls. Others stood on easels scattered throughout the space. The scent of oil paint and turpentine hung in the air. "You're an artist," Tom said, surprised. Victoria moved past him into the room. "I was many things before I was Victoria Harrington." She gestured to the paintings. "This is my past and my present, when strength allows." Tom moved slowly among the canvases. Some depicted landscapes, the mountains surrounding the ranch, the plains stretching toward distant horizons. Others were portraits, ranch hands, townsfolk, and many of a handsome, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes whom Tom assumed was Henry Harrington. But it was the larger canvases at the back of the room that drew his attention. These showed scenes from what appeared to be stage productions, Shakespearean characters in elaborate costumes, dramatic poses frozen in moments of passion or despair. And in many of them, at the center, was a young woman with striking features and eyes that, even captured in paint, seemed to burn with intensity. "That's you," Tom said, recognizing Victoria, despite the decades between the paintings and the woman who stood beside him now. "Yes." Victoria touched one canvas gently. A portrait of herself in a deep blue gown, a crown of flowers in her dark hair. "Ophelia, the role that brought Henry to my dressing room with roses and promises." Tom studied the painting, seeing in the young actress's face echoes of the formidable woman Victoria had become. "Dr. Morris mentioned you were on the stage in San Francisco for 10 years, from the age of 16. Victoria moved to another canvas, this one showing her in a crimson dress, a dagger clutched in her raised hand. "Lady Macbeth, my finest role," Henry always said. Tom couldn't reconcile the passionate woman in the paintings with the severe, practical rancher he'd come to know. "You gave it up? The stage?" "For Henry, yes." Victoria's voice softened with memory. "He offered me a different kind of life. Adventure, he called it, building something lasting in a new territory." A wistful smile touched her lips. "I was tired of pretending to be other people. With Henry, I could simply be myself." Tom continued his circuit of the room, stopping before a canvas half covered by a cloth. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward. Victoria hesitated, then nodded. Tom lifted the cloth to reveal a portrait, unlike the others. A young girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with Victoria's dark eyes and Henry's strong jawline. She sat on a painted pony, laughing, one hand reaching toward the viewer. "My daughter," Victoria said quietly. "Catherine." Tom glanced at her sharply. "You told me you had no living children." "I don't." Victoria's voice was flat, emotionless. "Catherine died of scarlet fever when she was 6, a month before Henry. Fell ill." The pain in those simple sentences was palpable. Tom gently replaced the cloth over the portrait. "I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Few do. After Catherine died, I stopped going into town, after Henry followed. Victoria shrugged. There seemed little point in maintaining connections. Tom began to understand. So all this, the secrecy, the locked room, it's to protect your memories. Partly. Victoria moved to a large desk beneath one of the windows. From a drawer, she withdrew a leather portfolio. But there's more you need to know. She gestured for Tom to join her at a small sitting area in the corner of the studio. As he settled into an armchair, Victoria opened the portfolio and removed several documents. Before I married Henry, my name was Victoria Blackwood. She handed Tom a theatrical playbill from 1857, featuring her name prominently. I was relatively well known in certain circles. Tom studied the faded playbill. I don't understand what this has to do with our arrangement. Patience, Thomas. Victoria extracted another document from the portfolio, a newspaper clipping. Yellowed with age, the headline read, "Actress flees after millionaire's murder." Tom's eyes widened as he scanned the article. It described how a prominent San Francisco businessman, Charles Wellesley, had been found stabbed to death in his home. His mistress, actress Victoria Blackwood, had disappeared the same night, making her the prime suspect. "You were accused of murder," Tom said, looking up from the clipping. "I was innocent," Victoria stated firmly. Charles was killed by his wife's brother after discovering Charles had been embezzling from the family business. But by then, I was already gone, already Victoria Harrington, riding north with my new husband. Tom's mind raced. Does anyone know? Here in Montana. No one made the connection. I wore a veil for the first year, claiming sensitivity to the sun. By the time Henry and I had established ourselves, the scandal had faded, replaced by fresher horrors. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the documents. Until 3 months ago. What happened? I received this. Victoria handed Tom a letter written in a neat, precise hand. "Dear Mrs. Harrington," it read. Or should I say Miss Blackwood, I recently acquired some interesting documents connecting you to unfortunate events in San Francisco some years ago. I wonder what the good people of Silveridge would think of. Harboring a fugitive from justice all these years? Perhaps we should discuss how to keep such information private. Yours truly, Philip Harrington. Tom felt a cold anger building in his chest. Blackmail. That's why he's so confident about challenging your ownership of the ranch. Victoria nodded grimly. Philip always resented that Henry left everything to me. For years he's tried to find ways to discredit me, to suggest I manipulated Henry. Somehow, when he discovered my past... She sighed heavily. In my condition, I haven't the strength to fight both cancer and scandal. "So you married me," Tom said, understanding dawning, "to ensure the ranch wouldn't fall into Philip's hands after your death." "Yes, the property transfers we've completed are binding, regardless of any revelations about my past. You now legally own half of everything and will inherit the rest when I die." Victoria's dark eyes held his. "Philip can spread whatever rumors he likes about Victoria Blackwood, but he cannot touch what is rightfully yours." Tom sat back, processing this new information. "Why me, though? Why not Samuel, or someone else who's been loyal to you for years?" Victoria smiled faintly. "Because you have nothing to lose, Thomas. No reputation to protect, no position to maintain. You're outside Philip's sphere of influence, and..." She hesitated. "Dr. Morris speaks highly of your character. He said you buried your brother with your own hands rather than accept charity for a proper funeral. That you work honestly despite your circumstances, that you've never forgotten a debt. Morris has been watching me, reporting to you." "I needed to be sure," Victoria said simply. "This ranch, everything Henry and I built together, is Catherine's legacy as much as ours. I couldn't risk leaving it to someone who might squander it or sell it to the highest bidder, especially not to Philip." Tom stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the ranch that was now partly his. The land stretched golden in the fading light, cattle moving like shadows across the distant pastures. Everything he saw represented a life he'd never imagined possible for himself. "What do you want me to do about Philip?" he asked finally. "Nothing for now. He'll make his next move soon enough." Victoria joined him at the window, standing close enough that Tom could smell the faint lavender scent she wore. "I've shown you this room, these secrets, so you'll understand what you're defending when the time comes." Tom turned to face her. In the soft light of the studio, with the paintings of her younger self surrounding them, Victoria seemed less the stern ranch owner and more the woman who had once played passionate heroines on distant stages. "I'll protect what's yours," he promised. "What's ours now?" For the first time since they'd met, Victoria's smile reached her eyes. "I believe you will." Udini, in the days that followed, Tom found his relationship with Victoria subtly altered. Though she maintained her formal demeanor at meals and in the presence of the staff, when they were alone, she began to share stories of her life, her childhood, in Boston, her years on the stage, her adventures with Henry as they built the ranch from nothing. Tom, in turn, spoke of his own past, of his father, a drifter who taught his sons to read Shakespeare by firelight between odd jobs and failed schemes. Of William, whose steady nature had balanced Tom's restlessness. Of their dreams for the small ranch that had slipped through Tom's fingers after his brother's death. "You could rebuild it, you know," Victoria said one evening as they sat in her studio, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. "That parcel you and William owned, buy it back, make it what you'd planned." The suggestion startled Tom. He hadn't allowed himself to think of that possibility, even knowing the wealth that would soon be his. "I don't know if I could go back there. Perhaps not." Victoria nodded, understanding. "Some places hold too many ghosts." "Is that why you locked yourself away here? Because of the ghosts?" Victoria considered the question. "Partly, but mostly because the outside world held nothing I wanted after Henry and Catherine died." She turned to Tom with sudden intensity. "Promise me something, Thomas. If I can. When I'm gone, don't isolate yourself as I have. This land, this house, they're meant for living, not just remembering." The request unsettled Tom. Despite the unusual circumstances of their marriage, he'd begun to value Victoria's company, her sharp mind, her dry humor that emerged in unguarded moments. The reminder of her impending death struck him more deeply than he'd expected. "I promise," he said quietly. Victoria reached out and briefly touched his hand, the first gesture of genuine affection she'd shown him. "Good. Now help me downstairs. Dr. Morris will be waiting and he fusses if I'm late for my examination." As the second week of their marriage progressed, Victoria's health began to deteriorate more rapidly. She tired easily, ate less, and spent more time resting in her rooms. Dr. Morris increased his visits to twice daily, his expression growing graver with each examination. "How long?" Tom asked him bluntly one afternoon as the doctor prepared to leave. Morris sighed heavily. "A few weeks at most. The pain is becoming harder to manage. Soon she'll need laudanum regularly, which will affect her clarity of mind." Tom nodded, his throat tight. "Is there anything I can do?" "You're already doing it," Morris said gently. "Your presence has been a comfort to her, whether she admits it or not. I haven't seen her this animated in months." That evening, Tom found Victoria on the porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm evening air. She looked frail, diminished somehow, yet her eyes remained alert and penetrating. "Will you read to me, Thomas?" she asked, indicating a book on the small table beside her chair. "My eyes tire too quickly now." Tom picked up the volume, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, the pages well worn from frequent handling. He sat in the chair opposite hers and began to read, his voice low and steady in the gathering dusk. As the stars emerged above them, Tom read sonnet after sonnet, words of love and time and mortality flowing between them in the quiet night air. Victoria closed her eyes, listening, occasionally mouthing a familiar phrase alongside him. When he reached Sonnet 116, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," Victoria opened her eyes and regarded him thoughtfully. "You read well," she said when he'd finished. "Your father taught you more than just the words." Tom smiled faintly. "He said Shakespeare was worth knowing, even if nothing else he taught us amounted to much." He was right. Victoria shifted in her chair, wincing slightly. "Thomas, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned before our wedding." Before she could continue, they were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Samuel appeared from the shadows of the barn, rifle in hand, moving to position himself protectively near Victoria. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, pulling up short of the porch. The lead rider dismounted, and in the light spilling from the house windows, Tom recognized Philip Harrington. The man's face was flushed, his movements slightly unsteady, suggesting he'd been drinking. "Evening, Victoria," Philip called, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Hope I'm not interrupting a romantic moment with your cowboy husband." Victoria straightened in her chair, her weakness momentarily masked by dignity. "What do you want?" "Philip, just paying a neighborly visit." Philip mounted the porch steps, ignoring Samuel's warning gesture with the rifle. "Wanted to see how the happy couple is faring." His eyes, cold and calculating despite the alcohol, fixed on Tom. "Tell me, Mitchell, has she told you everything yet about San Francisco, about why she really married you?" Tom stood, placing himself between Victoria and her tormentor. "I know enough, Harrington. Now state your business or leave." Philip laughed, an ugly sound. My business is justice, Cowboy. For my uncle, who was tricked by a murdering actress. For my cousin, whose death was suspiciously convenient." "How dare you?" Victoria gasped, her voice shaking with rage. "Catherine's death nearly destroyed me." "So you claim." Philip's smile was cruel. "But your husband followed awfully quickly, didn't he? And now here you are, dying yourself, trying one last desperate move to keep what rightfully belongs to the Harrington family." Tom's hands clenched into fists. "That's enough. Get off this property." "Or what, Cowboy? You'll rough me up?" Philip's voice dripped contempt. "I'm not some ruffian you can intimidate. I have the law on my side." "The law?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call blackmail, Philip?" "I call it leverage, dear aunt." Philip reached inside his coat and withdrew an envelope, which I've now used to splendid effect. The territorial marshal will be arriving tomorrow with some interesting questions about events in San Francisco 20 years ago. I thought you should have tonight to prepare yourself. Victoria paled visibly, her hand clutching at her shawl. Tom took a menacing step toward Philip, but Victoria's voice stopped him. "No, Thomas, violence won't help." She turned her gaze to Philip. "You've finally done it then. After all these years of trying to destroy me, you've found a way." "Justice has been a long time coming," Philip agreed smugly, "but it's arrived at last." "And what of Henry's wishes?" Victoria demanded. "That this land remain intact, not carved up and sold off as you've always planned?" Philip shrugged. "Uncle Henry was sentimental. Business requires clearer thinking." "Business," Victoria repeated with contempt. "Is that all this land means to you? Not the home Henry loved, not the future he envisioned, just more dollars in your pocket." "It's what it should have meant to him," Philip snapped, his composure slipping. "Instead, he wasted his inheritance building this monument to frontier romanticism, and then left it to an actress who never belonged here to begin with. He left it to someone who loved it as he did," Victoria said quietly, "as you never could." Philip's face darkened with anger. Well, it hardly matters now, does it? By this time tomorrow, you'll be facing charges for a 20-year-old murder. Your reputation will be in tatters, and your desperate attempt to transfer ownership to this. He gestured dismissively at Tom. This drifter will be exposed as the fraud it is. Our marriage is legal, Tom interjected. The property transfers are legitimate. A marriage under false pretenses to evade justice? I think not. Philip smiled thinly. My lawyers assure me it will be simple to have it voided once Victoria's past comes to light. Victoria struggled to her feet, waving away Tom's offered assistance. Though physically diminished, she drew herself up with all the dignity of her theatrical training. You've always underestimated me, Philip, she said, her voice gaining strength. Always assumed I had no plans beyond what you could see. She turned to Tom. Thomas, would you please go to my study? In the top drawer of my desk, there's a sealed envelope addressed to the territorial marshal. Tom hesitated, reluctant to leave her alone with Philip, but Victoria nodded reassurance. Samuel is here. I'm perfectly safe. When Tom returned with the envelope, Victoria was seated again. Her breathing labored, but her expression composed. Philip remained on the porch, watching her with wary confusion. Open it, Victoria instructed Tom. Read it aloud, please. Tom broke the seal and unfolded several official-looking documents. The first was a letter from the San Francisco Police Department dated 6 months earlier to Mrs. Victoria Harrington, Tom read. In response to your inquiry, we confirm that the case involving Charles Wellesley's death in 1857 was officially closed in 1863 when Edward Pembroke confessed to the murder on his deathbed. All charges against Victoria Blackwood were posthumously dropped as she was presumed deceased after her disappearance. Records of this resolution may have been lost in the subsequent reorganization of the department, explaining your difficulty in obtaining this information previously. We apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. Tom looked up from the letter to find Philip's face drained of color. That's a forgery, Philip stammered. It must be. Read the next document, Victoria said calmly. The second paper was a sworn affidavit from a retired San Francisco detective attesting to the same facts outlined in the letter and adding his personal recollection of the Pembroke confession. This is impossible, Philip whispered. Not impossible, Victoria corrected. Merely thorough. I began making inquiries as soon as I received your blackmail attempt. It seems the truth was available all along, if one was interested in justice, rather than revenge. Tom continued through the documents, which included a letter from the territorial governor acknowledging receipt of the San Francisco Police Department's confirmation and expressing regret for any distress the confusion may have caused Mrs. Harrington. The marshal already has copies of everything you're holding, Victoria informed Philip, as does Judge Hamilton in Helena. Your dramatic revelation tomorrow will be met with boredom, I'm afraid. Philip's face contorted with rage. You think this changes anything? You're still dying. You've still married a nobody in a pathetic attempt to keep me from what's mine. What was never yours, Victoria corrected, and never will be. She gestured to Tom. The final document, please. The last paper in the envelope was a copy of Victoria's will, properly witnessed and notarized. Tom scanned it quickly, then read aloud the section Victoria indicated. In the event that my marriage to Thomas Mitchell is challenged after my death, and such challenge results in the nullification of property transfers made during our marriage, I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to the Montana Territorial Orphans Fund, with the stipulation that Harrington Ranch be maintained as a home for orphan children in perpetuity, never to be sold or divided. The silence fell over the porch. Philip stared at Victoria with naked hatred. You would rather see it become an orphanage than in Harrington hands, he hissed. "In your hands," Victoria clarified. "And yes, without hesitation." Her voice softened. "Henry would have approved, I think. He always wanted children's laughter to fill this house." Philip looked from Victoria to Tom, to the documents in Tom's hands. His shoulders sagged as the full implications sank in. "This isn't over," he said finally, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It is, Philip," Victoria replied wearily. "It has been for 20 years. You simply refuse to accept it." And without another word, Philip turned and stumbled down the porch steps. His companions, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, helped him mount his horse. The three riders disappeared into the darkness, the sound of their departure fading quickly in the still night air. When they were gone, Victoria slumped in her chair, the strength that had sustained her through the confrontation evaporating like morning dew. Tom knelt beside her, alarmed by her pallor. "Victoria, should I send for Dr. Morris?" She shook her head weakly. "No, just help me to my room. I need to rest." Tom gathered her in his arms, shocked by how little she weighed, like lifting a child or a bundle of dry sticks. Samuel hurried ahead to open doors as Tom carried Victoria through the house and up the stairs to her bedroom. The room was simply furnished despite its size. A large four-poster bed, a dressing table, a comfortable chair near the fireplace. The walls were adorned with just two paintings, a portrait of Henry and a landscape showing the ranch in spring, wildflowers dotting the foreground. Tom laid Victoria gently on the bed. "I'll fetch Emma to help you prepare for the night." Victoria caught his hand as he turned to go. "Wait, what I was going to tell you before Philip arrived." She paused, gathering her strength. "There's a letter in my desk in the second drawer, a letter from Robert Mitchell, your father." Tom stared at her in shock. "My father? What are you talking about?" "Robert worked for us the first year we established the ranch, before you and William came west." Victoria's voice was fading, her energy nearly spent. "He spoke of you often, proudly." "That's impossible," Tom whispered. "He never mentioned knowing you or Henry." "The letter explains. Read it tomorrow." Victoria's eyes drifted closed. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." Tom stood frozen, trying to process this unexpected revelation. His father had worked for the Harringtons, had known Henry and Victoria. It made no sense, yet it would explain how Victoria had known to find him, why she had chosen him specifically for her plan. "Thomas," Victoria murmured, her eyes still closed. "Thank you for defending what Henry built, what we built." Tom squeezed her hand gently. "Rest now. We'll talk more tomorrow." But as he gazed down at Victoria's exhausted face, Tom wondered if tomorrow would come for her at all. The night passed slowly. Tom sent for Dr. Morris, who arrived shortly before midnight and administered laudanum for Victoria's pain. The doctor's grim expression confirmed what Tom already feared. Victoria was fading rapidly, the confrontation with Philip having depleted her remaining strength. Unable to sleep, Tom went to Victoria's study and found the letter she had mentioned. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed to Victoria and Henry Harrington, in a hand Tom recognized immediately as his father's bold, slightly crooked script. For a long time, Tom simply held the envelope, uncertain whether he truly wanted to know its contents. Whatever connection had existed between his father and the Harringtons, Robert Mitchell had chosen to keep it secret. Perhaps there was good reason for that silence. Yet Victoria had preserved this letter for years, had kept it close even as she prepared for death. And she had wanted Tom to read it, had considered it important enough to mention even as her strength was failing. Taking a deep breath, Tom broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. "Dear Henry and Victoria," it began. By the time you receive this, I will be well on my way east with my boys. I want to thank you for the opportunity you gave me and to apologize for my abrupt departure. The truth is, the life you offered, honest work, fair pay, a future with roots, scared me more than I can say. I've spent too many years drifting. To believe I deserve stability. Tom paused, struck by the candor in his father's words. Robert Mitchell had never spoken so openly about his feelings, had maintained a gruff exterior that rarely revealed the thoughts beneath. The money you've advanced me, the letter continued, will help me get the boys established somewhere. William, especially, has his heart set on a place of our own. Perhaps Montana, though not too close to your spread, I couldn't bear your knowing if I fail again. Tom takes after me more than I'd like, restless, prone to dreams bigger than practicality. Allows, but he has a good heart, and William will keep him grounded. Tom felt a tightness in his chest as he read his father's assessment. How well Robert had known his sons, their strengths and weaknesses, their complementary natures. If fortune turns against us, as it has before, I ask only one thing. Keep an eye on my boys if you can. Not to interfere, they must make their own way, but to ensure they don't fall too far. I've enclosed a small portrait of them taken last year in St. Louis. They're good lads, the best thing I've ever done in this world. The letter concluded with formal thanks and Robert's signature. Tom searched the envelope but found no portrait. Perhaps Victoria had placed it elsewhere for safekeeping. He sat back in Victoria's chair, trying to reconcile this new information with the father he had known. Robert Mitchell had worked for the Harringtons, had been offered a permanent position, had even received an advance of money to help establish his family elsewhere. Yet he had never mentioned any of this to his sons. Instead, he had presented their journey west as a fresh start, a new adventure with no connection to what came before. And Victoria had known, had perhaps watched from afar, as Tom and William struggled to build their ranch, as William died, as Tom lost everything. Yet she had not intervened until now, when her own death approached and her legacy hung in the balance. Why? What had prevented her from reaching out sooner? And why had his father kept his connection to the Harringtons secret all these years? As dawn broke over the mountains, Tom was no closer to answers. But one thing had become clear through the night's revelations. His connection to Victoria and Harrington Ranch ran deeper than a convenient arrangement or a legal maneuver. Whatever had transpired between his father and the Harringtons, it had set in motion events that had culminated in this moment, with Tom poised to inherit everything Henry and Victoria had built, to become the guardian of their legacy. It was a responsibility Tom had accepted as part of their bargain. Now it felt like something more, a debt of honor spanning 2 generations, a promise his father had perhaps never intended for him to fulfill. Morning brought a hushed quality to Harrington Ranch, as if the land itself sensed the gravity of Victoria's condition. Tom stood at the window of his room, watching the ranch hands go about their morning chores with subdued efficiency. Word had spread quickly that the mistress of the house was failing, and a somber atmosphere had settled over the property. Dr. Morris had remained through the night, emerging from Victoria's room as dawn broke to inform Tom that Victoria was awake and asking for him. "She's lucid now," the doctor said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The laudanum has worn off, but so has its comfort. She's in considerable pain, but refusing more until she's spoken with you." Tom nodded, steeling himself. "How long does she have?" Morris sighed, removing his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose. "A day, perhaps 2. The disease has accelerated more rapidly than I anticipated. The confrontation with Philip last night didn't help matters." "I understand," Tom said, though in truth he felt anything but understanding. In the short time he'd known Victoria, she had upended his life completely. revealed connections he'd never imagined, and somehow, despite the strangeness of their arrangement, begun to matter to him in ways he hadn't expected. Victoria's room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. She lay propped against pillows, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her skin nearly as pale as the sheets that covered her. Despite her obvious weakness, her dark eyes remained alert, fixing on Tom as he entered. "You read the letter," she said, her voice thin but steady. Tom pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat. "Yes, it raises more questions than it answers." Victoria smiled faintly. "I imagine it does." She shifted slightly, wincing. "Your father worked for us for nearly a year. He was skilled with horses, like you. Henry thought highly of him, offered him a permanent position as our stable master. But he left instead," Tom said. "Took the money you gave him and headed east to get us." Victoria nodded. "He spoke of you and William often, carried a small portrait he would show to anyone willing to listen. 2 boys, he said, who deserved better than the rootless life he'd given them so far." Tom struggled to reconcile this image with the father he'd known, a man of few words, prone to long silences and sudden departures. Why didn't he ever mention knowing you, or that he'd worked here? Pride, perhaps, Victoria suggested, or shame at having walked away from the opportunity Henry offered. She paused, gathering strength. Robert was a complicated man, charming, hard-working, but haunted in ways he never fully explained. "That sounds like him," Tom admitted, "but it doesn't explain why you never reached out to us. If you knew about William and me, knew we were struggling after Father died, why wait until now?" Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "We tried once. Henry rode out to your homestead about a year after you arrived in Montana. He intended to offer assistance, discreetly, of course, to honor Robert's memory." "I don't remember any visit," Tom said, frowning. "Because he never approached you," Victoria explained. "When he arrived, he found you and William working the fence line together. He said you were laughing, despite the obvious hardship, determined, capable, building something of your own. He couldn't bring himself to interfere, to suggest that you needed help." A shadow of pain crossed her face, whether physical or emotional. Tom couldn't tell. He said Robert's boys were doing just fine on their own. Tom thought back to those early days with William. The back-breaking work, yes, but also the satisfaction of seeing their plans take shape, the freedom of answering to no one but themselves and each other. "We were doing fine, until the winter of '78. Victoria's expression softened with sympathy. "After William died, I wanted to reach out, but by then Catherine was ill, and then Henry." She sighed. "Life has a way of sweeping us along, doesn't it? Carrying us past moments when we might have acted differently." Tom nodded, understanding all too well how quickly opportunities could slip away, how easily good intentions could be overwhelmed by immediate concerns. "So when you needed a husband, you thought of me because of my father. Because of what Henry had told me about you, yes. And because Dr. Morris confirmed you had grown into a man of integrity, despite your hardships." Victoria's gaze was direct, unflinching. "I needed someone I could trust with Henry's legacy, someone who would understand the value of this land beyond its price." "And what about your own legacy?" Tom asked. "The paintings, your life before Henry. What happens to Victoria Blackwood's memory?" The question seemed to surprise her. I hadn't given it much thought. The paintings were private, a way to remember who I had been before becoming Victoria Harrington. "They're remarkable," Tom said honestly. "Your talent shouldn't be hidden away." A hint of color touched Victoria's pale cheeks. "Perhaps someday the studio could be opened. Not right away. Some stories need time to be told properly." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sound Victoria's labored breathing. Outside, a meadowlark called, its clear notes drifting through the slightly open window. "There's something else you should know," Victoria said. "Finally, about Philip." Tom tensed. "What about him?" "He won't give up easily. Last night was a setback for him, but he's persistent." Victoria reached for a glass of water on her bedside table. Tom helped her drink, supporting her shoulders, which felt fragile beneath his hands. "He'll look for weaknesses, for mistakes, in the legal arrangements, and if he can't find any, he may resort to other methods." "What kind of methods?" Victoria settled back against the pillows. "Philip has connections with certain men in Helena, men who operate outside the law when it suits them. He's used them before to intimidate business rivals." Tom's jaw tightened. "You think he might try to harm me?" "I think he's desperate and bitter, a dangerous combination." Victoria's eyes held concern. "Be vigilant, Thomas, especially after I'm gone." "I can handle Philip Harrington," Tom assured her, though the warning had unsettled him. Conflicts in his experience had always been straightforward. Fists or guns, clear opponents, visible threats. The kind of danger Victoria was describing, legal. Entanglements, hidden enemies, attacks that might come from unexpected directions, was unfamiliar territory. "I believe you can." Victoria's hand moved across the coverlet, seeking his. Tom took it gently, surprised by the strength of her grip despite her weakened state. "Henry would have liked you, Thomas. He valued directness, honesty. He had no patience for pretense." "I wish I could have known him," Tom said sincerely. "Yes, you would have understood each other." Victoria's gaze drifted to the window, to the slice of blue sky visible between the curtains. "I have one more request if you're willing." "Name it." "In my studio there's a painting, unfinished. I've been working on it when I had the strength. I'd like you to see it completed." Tom frowned, uncertain what she was asking. "I'm not an artist, Victoria. I wouldn't know how—" "Not by your hand," she clarified with a small smile. "There's a woman in Helena, Margaret Fulton. She was my student briefly before her family moved east. She's returned recently, opened a small studio on Harris Street. I've arranged for her to finish the work if I couldn't." Victoria's expression grew intent. "Will you ensure it happens? That she has access to my studio, my materials?" "Of course," Tom promised, wondering what painting could be so important to occupy Victoria's thoughts now, as her life ebbed away. "Is it a portrait? A landscape?" "You'll see," Victoria replied, her voice growing fainter. "It's my gift to you, for all you've done, for all you will do." Tom wanted to press for more details, but Victoria's eyes had closed, exhaustion claiming her. He sat with her a while longer, still holding her hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the coverlet. Dr. Morris returned, feeling Victoria's pulse with practiced fingers. "She needs rest now," he said quietly, "and something for the pain. I'll send Emma to sit with her. Perhaps you should get some air, Thomas. There's nothing more to be done at the moment." Reluctantly, Tom released Victoria's hand and stood. "Send for me if there's any change." Outside, the day had bloomed into full morning, the sun burning away the mist that had clung to the distant pastures. Tom found Samuel near the stables, directing the day's work with his usual precision. "How is she?" the foreman asked, his weathered face etched with concern. "Failing," Tom replied honestly. "Dr. Morris thinks a day or two at most." Samuel nodded grimly. "I figured as much when he stayed the night." He studied Tom with assessing eyes. "You're handling this better than I expected." Tom wasn't sure how to respond. Was he handling it well? The woman he'd married less than 2 weeks ago was dying, as they'd both known she would. Their relationship had been a practical arrangement, not a love match. Yet Tom felt the approaching loss with an intensity that surprised him. "She's a remarkable woman," he said finally. "I wish I'd had more time to know her." Samuel's expression softened slightly, that she is strongest person I've ever met, man or woman. He hesitated, then added, Philip's back in town, by the way. Jake Wilson rode out first thing to warn us. Said Philip spent the night at the Silver Dollar, drinking heavily and making threats. Tom frowned. What kind of threats? The usual. Bluster at first, legal challenges, appeals to the territorial governor. But as the night wore on and the whiskey flowed, the talk turned darker. Jake said Philip was muttering about making sure you didn't live to enjoy Victoria's money. The warning echoed Victoria's own concerns. You think he's serious? Samuel shrugged. Hard to say. Philip's always been more talk than action, but he's never been this desperate before either. Might be worth keeping your eyes open. I appreciate the warning. Tom glanced toward the main house, thinking of Victoria, lying pale and diminished against the pillows. I should get back inside. As he turned to go, Samuel called after him, Mitchell, for what it's worth, I was wrong about you. Victoria chose better than I thought. The unexpected approval warmed Tom despite the circumstances. Thank you. The day progressed with agonizing slowness. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to speak briefly with Tom or Dr. Morris, other times lost in dreams or memories, murmuring names Tom didn't recognize. By evening, she could no longer take water without choking, and Dr. Morris increased the laudanum to keep her comfortable. It won't be long now, the doctor told Tom as they stood in the hallway outside Victoria's room. Hours rather than days. You should prepare yourself. Tom nodded mechanically, feeling oddly detached from the reality of what was happening. Part of him still couldn't believe that in less than 2 weeks, he had gone from a penniless cowhand to the heir of one of the largest ranches in Montana Territory. That he had married a woman he barely knew, only to lose her before he truly had a chance to understand who she was. Does she have any family that should be notified? Tom asked suddenly, realizing he had never inquired about Victoria's roots. Beyond what she had volunteered, Dr. Morris shook his head. None that she acknowledges. There was a sister once, I believe, but they had a falling out many years ago. Victoria specified no funeral, no service beyond a simple burial beside Henry and Catherine. The answer felt incomplete to Tom. Victoria had lived a full life before becoming Victoria Harrington, had been a celebrated actress, had known both acclaim and scandal. Surely there were people from that former existence who would want to know of her passing, but perhaps that was the point. Victoria had chosen to reinvent herself completely when she married Henry, to leave behind not only her name, but the connections and relationships of her previous life. She had built something new here in Montana, something that existed independently of her past. As if reading Tom's thoughts, Dr. Morris added gently, Victoria has been very clear about her wishes, Thomas. A private burial, attended only by those who knew her here in the life she chose. Tom accepted this with a nod. I'll honor her wishes, of course. Night fell over Harrington Ranch. A lamp burned in Victoria's room, where Emma sat vigilant, beside the bed while Tom paced the hallway outside, unable to settle. At midnight, Dr. Morris suggested Tom try to rest, offering a sleeping powder which Tom declined. How could he sleep when Victoria's life was slipping away mere feet from where he stood? In the darkest hour before dawn, Emma appeared in the hallway, her face drawn with exhaustion and emotion. She's asking for you, Mr. Mitchell. She's awake and clear-headed, the doctor says, though he doesn't know how or why. Tom entered the dimly lit bedroom to find Victoria propped against her pillows, her eyes bright with an intensity that seemed to belie her physical condition. Dr. Morris stood nearby, his expression a mixture of professional assessment and personal concern. Thomas, Victoria said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Come sit with me. Tom took his place in the chair beside her bed, struck by the change in her. Though still deathly pale, there was a clarity to her gaze, a focus that had been absent during her periods of wakefulness throughout the day. "Dr. Morris tells me it's a rally," she said with a small smile. "A final gathering of strength before the end. It happens sometimes, apparently." "Don't talk like that," Tom said, though he knew her assessment was accurate. "Truth is preferable to comfort at this stage," Victoria replied firmly. "I have very little time, Thomas, and things that must be said." She glanced at Dr. Morris. "Edwin, would you give us a few minutes?" The doctor hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his patient. "5 minutes," he conceded. "No more. You need to conserve what strength you have." When they were alone, Victoria reached for Tom's hand, her touch cool against his skin. "You've done more than I had any right to ask," she began. "Married a stranger, taken on responsibilities you never sought, prepared to defend a legacy not your own." Tom shook his head. "You've given me far more than I've given you, a future I never thought possible." "Perhaps, but wealth without purpose is a poor inheritance." Victoria's fingers tightened around his. "I want you to promise me something, Thomas. Not as my husband, but as the man I've come to know these past days." "Anything," Tom said, meaning it. "Live here," Victoria said intently. "Not just as owner, not just as caretaker of what Henry built. Make this place your home. Fill it with life again, with family, if you find someone to share it with purpose at the very least." The request caught Tom by surprise. He had assumed he would stay, of course. Where else would he go, now that Harrington Ranch was his? But Victoria seemed to be asking for more than his physical presence. She wanted him to truly inhabit the life she was leaving behind, to continue not just the business of the ranch, but its spirit. "I promise," he said softly. "This place will be cared for. It will be lived in." Victoria nodded, satisfied. "Good. There's a letter in my desk for you. Instructions for after I'm gone. Practical matters." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "And Thomas, don't let Philip drive you away. This land belongs to you now, by right and by law. Fight for it as we did." "I will," Tom assured her. "You don't need to worry about Philip." A faint smile touched Victoria's lips. "I've spent 15 years worrying about Philip. Hard to break the habit now." The smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that gave weight to her next words. "Be careful, Thomas. Philip is dangerous in ways you may not expect. Don't underestimate him." "I won't," Tom promised, though he privately thought Victoria might be overestimating her nephew-in-law. The man he'd seen on the porch the previous night had been angry, yes, but also pathetic, a bully thwarted, lashing out in frustration rather than calculated malice. Victoria seemed to read his thoughts. "You think I'm being overcautious? Perhaps. But I've known Philip longer than you have. There's a cruelty in him that only shows itself when he believes he's been wronged." Before Tom could respond, Dr. Morris returned, his pocket watch in hand. "That's 5 minutes, Victoria. You need to rest now." Victoria nodded, her momentary strength already beginning to fade. "Just a moment more, Edwin." She turned back to Tom, her dark eyes holding his with unexpected intensity. "Thank you, Thomas Mitchell, for giving an old woman peace in her final days." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Victoria Harrington, for giving a lost cowboy a home." The ghost of a smile touched her lips once more, and then her eyes closed, the brief rally of strength exhausted. Dr. Morris moved to check her pulse, nodding with professional satisfaction that it remained steady, if weak. "She'll sleep now," he told Tom quietly. "Perhaps for the last time. You should try to rest as well." Tom nodded, but he knew sleep would not come. Instead, he made his way downstairs to Victoria's study, where he found the letter she had mentioned. In the center of her desk, his name written across the envelope in her elegant hand. Inside were indeed instructions. practical matters concerning her burial, the running of the ranch in the immediate aftermath of her death, contacts in Helena who could assist with legal questions. But at the end of these pragmatic details was a personal note that caught Tom by surprise. "Thomas," it read, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that our arrangement, which began as a practical solution to a difficult problem, became something more to me in these final days. Your kindness, your integrity, your willingness to listen to an old woman's stories. These have been unexpected gifts in my last chapter. I believe that nothing in life is truly coincidental, that Robert Mitchell came to work for us all those years ago, that his sons would later settle nearby, that you would be the man I needed when my time grew short. These seemed to me like threads in a pattern too complex for us to fully comprehend. I have no right to ask more of you than I already have, but I will anyway. Remember me sometimes, not just as the woman who left you this ranch, but as someone who recognized in you the same qualities Henry possessed. Strength tempered with kindness, ambition balanced by principle. Live well, Thomas Mitchell. Make this house a home again, and when you look out over the land that is now yours, know that somewhere Henry and I are pleased with how our story has ended." The letter was signed simply Victoria, the first time she had used only her given name in any communication with him. Tom folded the paper carefully and returned it to its envelope, unexpectedly moved by Victoria's words. Their relationship had indeed evolved from a cold business arrangement to something warmer, more human. Not love, certainly, but a genuine connection that transcended their unusual circumstances. Dawn was breaking as Tom made his way back upstairs, golden light spilling through the east-facing windows of the hallway. He paused outside Victoria's door, listening. No movement, no voices. Only the profound silence that often accompanies the most significant moments in life. He knew before he entered what he would find. Victoria Harrington lay still against the pillows, her silver hair spread around her like a halo, her face relaxed in death as it rarely had been in life. Dr. Morris stood at the foot of the bed, his head bowed. Emma knelt beside it, quietly, weeping. "When?" Tom asked simply. 20 minutes ago, Morris replied, peacefully in her sleep. Tom nodded, a strange numbness settling over him. He had known this was coming, had known it from the moment Victoria proposed their arrangement, yet the reality of her death struck him with unexpected force, as if some part of him had believed that Victoria Harrington was too formidable to succumb, even to an enemy as implacable as cancer. "I'll need to notify the staff," Tom said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, "and make arrangements for the burial." Dr. Morris placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "There's time for that. Take a moment first." Tom approached the bed, looking down at the woman who had, in less than 2 weeks, completely transformed his life. In death, Victoria looked smaller somehow, the force of personality that had made her seem larger than her physical frame now absent. Yet there was a serenity to her expression that had not been there in life, a peace that suggested she had accomplished what she set out to do. "I'll keep my promise," Tom said softly, too low for the others to hear. "This place will be cared for, it will be lived in." The day that followed passed in a blur of activity. Samuel took charge of notifying the ranch hands, while Emma tended to Victoria's body with the assistance of 2 other maids. Dr. Morris provided the death certificate, listing the cause as advanced carcinoma and promising to handle the necessary healings in Silveridge. Tom found himself oddly removed from these proceedings, as if observing them from a distance. He gave instructions when asked, made decisions when required, but moved through the day in a state of suspended reality. By evening, Victoria had been laid out in the parlor, dressed in a simple black gown, her silver hair arranged around her, shoulders just as Tom had seen it on her final morning. She looks peaceful, Samuel observed, standing beside Tom as they viewed the body. "More than she has in months." Tom nodded in agreement. "She fought hard, right to the end." "That was Victoria's way," Samuel said with a hint of pride. "Never surrendered even when the odds were impossible." He hesitated, then added, "The men are asking about the burial, when it will be, what's expected of them." "Tomorrow at sunset," Tom decided, beside Henry and Catherine as she wanted, simple, private, just those who knew her. Samuel nodded approval. She'd appreciate that. No fuss, no show. As night fell, Tom found himself alone in the parlor with Victoria's body. The house was quiet, the staff having retired after the emotionally draining day. Tom sat in a chair near the casket, oddly reluctant to leave. It seemed wrong somehow to abandon Victoria on her last night in the home she had shared with Henry. The home where she had grieved for her daughter and husband, the home she had fought so hard to protect. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," Tom said aloud, his voice soft in the stillness. "To step into your shoes, to take responsibility for everything you and Henry built." He smiled ruefully. 2 weeks ago, my biggest concern was whether Blackwell would pay me on time. Now I own 5,000 acres and more cattle than I can count. The absurdity of his situation struck him suddenly. Sitting in the dark, talking to a dead woman he'd barely known, a woman who had made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory, through a marriage that had lasted just 13 days. If anyone had described such a scenario to Tom a month ago, he would have laughed at its implausibility. Yet here he was, Thomas Mitchell, no longer a drifting cowhand, but master of Harrington Ranch, husband and now widower of Victoria Harrington, and the target of Philip Harrington's undying resentment. The thought of Philip sobered Tom's momentary amusement. Victoria's warnings echoed in his mind. "Be vigilant," she had said. "Philip is dangerous in ways you may not expect." Tom had taken the warning seriously, but perhaps not seriously enough. Tomorrow, Victoria would be buried, and Tom would officially become the sole owner of everything the Harringtons had built. Philip had already demonstrated his willingness to use underhanded tactics to challenge Victoria's ownership. What might he do to contest Tom's? As if summoned by his thoughts, a noise from the direction of the kitchen caught Tom's attention. A soft scraping, barely audible in the quiet house. Probably nothing, he told himself. An old house settling, or perhaps Emma checking on something before bed. But then came another sound, the distinct click of the back door latch being carefully manipulated. Tom rose silently from his chair, years of caution honed by hard living, making him instantly alert. He moved to the parlor doorway, listening intently. Footsteps now, soft, deliberate, trying to be silent but betrayed by a creaking floorboard. Someone was in the house, moving with the careful precision of an intruder, not the comfortable familiarity of a resident. Tom's pistol was upstairs in his room, too far to reach without potentially alerting the intruder. Instead, he scanned the parlor for a weapon, settling on a heavy brass fireplace poker. Gripping it firmly, he positioned himself beside the doorway, waiting. The footsteps grew closer, approaching the parlor where Victoria lay. Tom held his breath, every muscle tensed in readiness. A shadow appeared in the doorway, then a figure, tall, male, moving with deliberate stealth. Tom raised the poker, prepared to strike, when a familiar voice whispered, "Mitchell, you in here?" "Samuel." Tom lowered the weapon, relief flooding through him. "What the hell are you doing sneaking around in the dark?" The foreman stepped fully into the room, his expression grim in the faint moonlight streaming through the windows. "Checking the house. Jake Wilson rode out 20 minutes ago with a warning. Philip Harrington left the Silver Dollar an hour ago with 2 men, strangers not from around here. They were armed, and Philip was making no secret of his intention to settle things with you tonight." Tom's earlier concerns crystallized into immediate threat. "You think they're coming here?" "I think we need to be prepared if they do," Samuel replied. "I've stationed Ben and Charlie near the main gate. With rifles, the rest of the men are on alert." The precautions seemed excessive to Tom. Surely even Philip wouldn't be foolish enough to attack Harrington Ranch directly, but Victoria's warnings about her nephew-in-law's vindictiveness gave him pause. "We should move, Victoria," Tom decided. "If there's going to be trouble, it shouldn't happen here with her." Samuel nodded agreement. "The small chapel Henry built for Catherine, we can take her there until morning." Together, they carefully closed the casket and, with silent reverence, carried it through the darkened house and out into the cool night air. The small stone chapel stood 100 yards from the main house, a simple structure nestled among pine trees that Henry had built as a memorial to his daughter. Inside, a single stained glass window caught the moonlight, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. They placed Victoria's casket before the altar and stepped back, both men removing their hats in respect. "I'll stay with her," Samuel offered. "You should get back to the house, get your gun. If Philip's really coming, better to face him prepared." Tom hesitated, reluctant to leave Victoria alone on her final night, even with Samuel standing guard. But the foreman was right. If trouble was coming, Tom needed to be ready to meet it. "I'll be back soon," he promised, then slipped out into the night, moving quickly across the open ground between the chapel and the main house. He had just reached the back porch when a voice called from the shadows, "That's far enough, Mitchell." Tom froze, recognizing Philip Harrington's distinctive drawl. Slowly, he turned to face the direction of the voice. Philip emerged from the darkness near the garden wall, a revolver in his hand. Behind him, two men Tom didn't recognize flanked him like silent sentinels, their own weapons at the ready. "Evening, Philip," Tom said calmly, assessing his options. The poker he'd carried earlier was gone, left behind in the chapel. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and exposed on the open ground of the yard. "Where's your dead wife?" Philip asked, his tone mockingly casual. "I thought I'd pay my respects before we discuss business." "Victoria's not here," Tom replied, deliberately vague. "What kind of business requires guns in the middle of the night?" Philip stepped closer, his face visible now in the faint light from the house windows. He looked unwell, eyes bloodshot, skin sallow, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "The kind that settles debts, Cowboy. The kind that rights wrongs. There are no debts between us, Philip," Tom said evenly. "And no wrongs to right. Victoria made her choices legally and clearly. The ranch is mine now. That's the end of it." Philip laughed, an ugly sound in the quiet night. "The end? No, Mitchell. This is just the beginning." He gestured with his revolver. "Inside, we're going to have a conversation about the future of Harrington Ranch." Tom assessed his chances of reaching cover before Philip or his men could fire. Not good. Better to play for time. Hope that Samuel would realize something was wrong when Tom didn't return to the chapel. "After you," Tom said, gesturing toward the house. Philip shook his head. "I'm not a fool, Mitchell. You first. Hands where I can. See them." Tom complied, walking slowly toward the back door with his hands raised to shoulder height. Behind him, he could hear Philip and his companions following, their boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Inside the kitchen, lamps still burned low, left that way by Emma for anyone needing a late cup of tea or coffee. The familiar space, where Tom had sat many mornings watching the staff prepare breakfast, listening to their quiet conversations, now felt alien, transformed by the presence of Philip and his armed men. "Sit," Philip ordered, indicating a chair at the kitchen table. Tom sat, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The two men with Philip took positions by the doors, effectively blocking any escape route. Up close, Tom could see they were hard men, the kind who hired out for any job that paid well enough, regardless of its nature. "Now," Philip said, sitting across from Tom but keeping his revolver trained steadily on Tom's chest, "let's discuss terms." "Terms for what?" Tom asked, playing ignorant though he suspected he knew exactly what Philip intended. "For your departure from Harrington Ranch," Philip replied as if stating the obvious. "You're going to sign over ownership to me, take a modest settlement, enough to set yourself up somewhere far from here, and disappear tonight." Tom shook his head slowly. "That's not going to happen, Philip. Victoria wanted me to have the ranch. It's legally mine now." "Victoria was not in her right mind," Philip snapped, his composure slipping. "Marrying a nobody, a drifter with no experience running an operation of this size. It's absurd on its face. Any judge would agree." "Then take it to a judge," Tom challenged. "If you're so confident, why the midnight visit with armed men?" Philip's expression darkened. "Because justice moves too slowly sometimes. Because I've waited 15 years for what's rightfully mine, and I'm not waiting any longer." "It was never rightfully yours," Tom pointed out. "Henry left everything to Victoria. That was his choice. A choice made under her influence." Philip's voice rose sharply. "She manipulated him, just as she manipulated you, the actress playing her greatest role, the devoted wife." Tom felt a surge of anger at Philip's characterization of Victoria. "You didn't know her at all, did you? Never bothered to understand what she and Henry built together?" "What I understand," Philip replied coldly, "is that in less than 2 weeks, you've managed to secure a fortune you did nothing to earn. That stops tonight. You're going to sign these papers." He reached into his coat and withdrew several folded documents. "A transfer of ownership, witnessed by these gentlemen. In return, you receive $5,000, more than fair for a man in your position." Tom didn't bother to look at the papers. "And if I refuse," Philip smiled thinly, "then there will be a tragic accident. A grieving widower, overcome by the responsibility of his new position, takes his own life. Or perhaps rustlers attack the ranch, killing the new owner in the process. The specific story doesn't matter. The outcome does." The threat was explicit. Now Philip's intentions clear. This was no bluff, no attempt to intimidate. Philip Harrington had come to Harrington Ranch, prepared to kill for what he believed was rightfully his. "You've thought this through," Tom said, buying time as he considered his options. Where was Samuel? How long before the foreman realized something was wrong? 15 years gives a man plenty of time to think," Philip replied bitterly, "to watch what should have been his slipping further away with each passing year." He pushed the papers across the table. "Sign them, Mitchell. Take the money and walk away. It's more than a man like you could ever have hoped for." Tom made no move toward the documents. "Victoria warned me about you, said you were dangerous in ways I might not expect." "Smart woman, my aunt." Philip's finger caressed the trigger of his revolver. "You should have listened to her." The moment stretched between them, tense with unspoken threat. In the silence, Tom became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere, a shift in the air, a sense of movement beyond the kitchen walls. Philip, focused intently on Tom, seemed not to notice. "Last chance, Mitchell," Philip said, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Sign the papers or I'll sign your death certificate instead." Tom deliberately relaxed his posture, leaning back in his chair with a casualness he didn't feel. "You know what Victoria told me about you, Philip, that you never really understood this land." Tom's words were interrupted by a sharp crack as the kitchen window shattered. Philip jerked in surprise, his gun wavering momentarily. In that instant, Tom lunged across the table, tackling Philip to the floor. The revolver discharged with a deafening report, the bullets splintering wood somewhere above their heads, chaos erupted. The two hired men scrambled for position, their own weapons drawn but hesitant to fire, with Philip and Tom grappling on the floor. From outside came shouts and the sound of running feet. "Boss!" one of the men called uncertainly. "The ranch hands are coming. Must be a dozen of them." Philip struggled beneath Tom, his face contorted with rage. "Shoot him!" he screamed. "Just shoot him!" Before either man could act, the kitchen door burst open. Samuel stood framed in the doorway, rifle raised. "Drop your weapons!" he commanded. "Now!" The two hired guns exchanged glances, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against them. Behind Samuel, more figures appeared. Ranch hands armed with rifles and shotguns, their faces grim with determination. One of Philip's men made his decision, slowly lowering his pistol to the floor. The other hesitated a moment longer before following suit. On the floor, Tom maintained his grip on Philip, pinning the struggling man despite his thrashing resistance. "It's over, Philip," he said, his voice leveled despite the pounding of his heart. "You've lost." "Like hell it is," Philip snarled, managing to free one hand. Before Tom could react, Philip had produced a small derringer from an inner pocket of his coat. The pocket pistol gleamed dully in the lamplight as Philip aimed it at Tom's head from point-blank range. A single shot echoed through the kitchen. Philip's body went limp beneath Tom, the derringer falling unfired from suddenly. Nerveless fingers. Blood spread across Philip's chest, staining his expensive shirt crimson. Tom rolled away, looking up to see Samuel lowering his rifle, a thin tendril of smoke still rising from its barrel. "You all right?" the foreman asked, his voice steady. Tom nodded, too stunned to speak. He looked down at Philip, who lay motionless, eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The man who had spent 15 years coveting Harrington Ranch had died in its kitchen, never to possess a single acre. "Get Dr. Morris," Tom finally managed, though he could see that medical attention would be futile. "And wake Emma and the others. There's been enough death in this house. I won't have more secrets." By dawn, order had been restored to Harrington Ranch. Dr. Morris arrived to pronounce Philip dead, and, with obvious reluctance, to notify the territorial marshal of what had occurred. Philip's hired men were locked in a storeroom under guard, awaiting the law's arrival. Victoria's body had been returned to the parlor, her peaceful repose seemingly undisturbed by the violence that had erupted in her home. Tom sat beside her, casket as the first light of morning filtered through the windows, his thoughts a jumble of grief, shock, and unexpected resolve. "You were right about him," he said softly to Victoria. "Right to be cautious, right to plan as carefully as you did." He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I wish you could have been wrong, just this once." Samuel appeared in the doorway, his weathered face lined with fatigue, but his eyes clear and direct. "Marshall's on his way from Silveridge. Should be here by noon." Tom nodded acknowledgement. "How are the men?" "Shaken but steady. They understand what happened, why it happened." Samuel entered the room fully, coming to stand beside Victoria's casket. "She would have been proud of you, Tom. You protected what mattered to her." "We all did," Tom corrected. "This was never just about me." Samuel smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Tom had seen from the foreman. "No, I suppose it wasn't. Victoria built something here larger than any one person, a community, a purpose." Philip never understood that. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, united in their respect for the woman who had brought them together and the legacy she had left in their care. "What happens now?" Samuel asked finally. Tom considered the question, feeling the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. "We bury Victoria as she wished. We deal with the marshal and whatever legal proceedings follow. And then..." He paused, looking out the window at the ranch stretching toward the distant mountains. "Then we continue what Henry and Victoria started together." The burial took place at sunset, as Victoria had requested. The small family plot sat on a gentle rise overlooking the ranch house, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that Henry had commissioned from a blacksmith in Helena. 2 graves already occupied the space, Catherine's small marker decorated with carved roses, and Henry's larger headstone standing protectively beside it. Victoria's casket was lowered into the earth as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch hands stood in a respectful semicircle, hats removed, faces solemn. Dr. Morris read a brief passage from Shakespeare, Victoria's beloved Sonnet 116, his voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom, the doctor recited. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. When the final words had been spoken and the first shovelfuls of earth had been returned to the grave, the ranch hands filed past Tom one by one, offering awkward but sincere condolences. These men had known Victoria far longer than Tom had witnessed her strength through years of hardship and triumph. Their respect was genuine, their loss real. Jake Wilson was among the last to approach, having ridden out from Silveridge for the burial. "Never imagined it would end like this," he said, shaking Tom's hand. "You all right?" Tom considered the question. Was he all right? His life had transformed completely in the span of 2 weeks. He had married, inherited a fortune, widowed, and killed a man, or at least been directly responsible for a death. Nothing about his circumstances was familiar or expected, yet beneath the shock and grief, Tom felt something unexpected: purpose. Victoria had entrusted him with more than property. She had given him a legacy to maintain, a community to lead, a future to build. "I will be," he answered honestly. "It's a lot to take in." Jake nodded understanding. "Town's talking about nothing else. Half think you're the luckiest son of a gun alive. The other half figure you'll run the place into the ground within a year." Tom smiled grimly. "We'll see about that." As darkness settled over the ranch, the mourners dispersed, returning to their duties or heading to the bunkhouse for the evening meal. Tom remained at the graveside, reluctant to leave Victoria alone on her first night beneath the Montana sky she had loved. Samuel approached quietly, carrying a lantern against the gathering dusk. "You should eat something," he suggested. "It's been a long day." Tom nodded, but made no move to leave. "I was just thinking about everything Victoria accomplished. Coming here as a young actress, adapting to frontier life, helping Henry build all this, then losing Catherine and Henry, yet still finding the strength to continue, to protect what they created together." "She was the strongest person I've ever known," Samuel agreed. "But she wasn't alone. Henry stood beside her until he couldn't anymore. The rest of us did what we could after he was gone." He paused, studying Tom's face in the lantern light. "And now she's made sure you won't be alone either." The observation struck Tom with unexpected force. He had been focusing on what Victoria had given him, the ranch, the responsibility, the wealth, without fully appreciating the community that came with it. Samuel, Emma, the ranch hands who had rallied to defend their home against Philip's threat, these people were now his people, his family, in a sense he hadn't experienced since William's death. "Thank you," Tom said simply, "for everything, these past days, for having my back when it mattered most." Samuel shrugged off the gratitude. "Victoria chose you. That was good enough for me." He held out the lantern. "Come on, Emma's kept supper warm, and there's decisions to be made about tomorrow." Tom took a final look at the fresh grave, now a dark rectangle against the lighter soil. "Goodbye, Victoria," he said softly. "Rest easy now." In the weeks that followed, life at Harrington Ranch gradually established a new rhythm. The territorial marshal's investigation into Philip's death concluded that Samuel had acted in defense of Tom's life, a finding supported by the testimony of the hired men who accepted lesser charges in exchange for their cooperation. The legal issues surrounding Victoria's estate proved less complicated than Tom had feared. The property transfers completed before her death were indeed binding, and with Philip gone, there were no remaining Harrington relatives interested in contesting Tom's ownership. One bright autumn morning, Tom rode to the small art studio in Helena that belonged to Margaret Fulton, the artist Victoria had mentioned in her final days. The woman who greeted him was younger than Tom had expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and paint-stained fingers. "Mrs. Harrington wrote to me about finishing her final painting," Margaret explained, inviting Tom into the sunlit studio. "I was honored by her trust. She was an exceptional artist, you know. Could have had a career in it if she hadn't chosen another path." "So I've discovered," Tom said, thinking of the paintings in Victoria's private studio, which he had recently begun cataloguing with Margaret's professional assistance. "Did she tell you what the unfinished work depicted?" Margaret smiled. "She wanted it to be a surprise for you. It's nearly complete now. Would you like to see it?" Tom nodded, curious about this final gift Victoria had arranged for him. Margaret led him to a large canvas positioned near a north-facing window. Tom's breath caught as he took in the scene Victoria had begun, and Margaret had nearly finished. The painting showed Harrington Ranch as viewed from the rise where the family plot was located. In the foreground stood the iron fence enclosing 3 graves, rendered with loving detail. But it was the rest of the composition that struck Tom most powerfully. The ranch house gleamed in the distance, smoke rising from its chimneys. Children played in the yard, fictitious children, products of Victoria's imagination, but painted with such life that they seemed ready to leap from the canvas. A man on horseback, his features deliberately reminiscent of Tom's, rode toward the house, returning home at day's end. And at the edges of the scene, subtle but unmistakable, translucent figures watched over the living. Henry, Catherine, and a self-portrait of Victoria herself, their expressions serene as they observed the continuation of life on the land they had loved. It was not a painting of the past, Tom realized, but of a possible future. Victoria's vision of what Harrington Ranch could become after she was gone. Not a mausoleum to memory, but a living, breathing place where new stories could unfold against the backdrop of what had come before. "It's extraordinary," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw all this before she died?" "She described it to me in great detail," Margaret confirmed. "Said it represented her deepest hope for the ranch, that it would remain a home, not just a business, that it would know children's laughter again someday." Tom studied the painting, noting the care with which both Victoria and Margaret had rendered each element. The mountains in the distance, the cattle grazing in the pastures, the flowers blooming along the garden path. It was both a farewell, a gift, and a gentle directive. Here is what might be. Make it real. When the painting was finished and delivered to the ranch, Tom hung it in the main parlor where Victoria had once lain in state. It became a talking point for visitors, a window into a possible future that Tom found himself increasingly determined to realize. 6 months after Victoria's death, Harrington Ranch was thriving under Tom's stewardship. With Samuel's guidance and the loyalty of the staff Victoria had assembled, Tom had navigated his first calving season successfully. The spring cattle drive to Helena had brought excellent prices, and improvements to the irrigation system were already showing results in the eastern pastures. On a perfect Sunday afternoon in May, Tom rode out to the family plot on the rise, a small bunch of wildflowers in hand. He placed them carefully on Victoria's grave, now marked by a simple headstone that matched Henry's in design. "The ranch is doing well," he said, having fallen into the habit of speaking to Victoria when he visited. Samuel says we might have the best crop of calves in years. Emma's training 2 new girls from town to help with the house. He smiled. And I've invited Jake Wilson to join us as assistant foreman. Figured it was time to expand a bit. Dit. Breeze ruffled Tom's hair as he surveyed the land stretched before him. His land now, though he still thought of it as belonging partly to the Harringtons, to the legacy he had promised to maintain. I'm thinking about the north section, he continued. That piece we're not using effectively. Victoria's School for Frontier Youth might not be such a bad idea. There are too many children in Silver Ridge with nowhere to go, no one to teach them. He chuckled softly. Never thought I'd consider becoming a rancher and a schoolmaster, but life takes unexpected turns, doesn't it? As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Tom rose from his place beside Victoria's grave. The ranch house below was beginning to light up as Emma prepared for the evening meal. Ranch hands were returning from their day's work, the sounds of their conversations and laughter carrying faintly on the wind. Thank you, Tom said simply, addressing all 3 graves, but particularly Victoria's, for the chance to build something that matters. I won't waste it. As he mounted his horse and rode down the hill toward home, Tom Mitchell, once a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name, now master of Harrington Ranch, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since William's death. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.